In 1863, Jim Crow was born. This character was created by white men to amuse a white audience. Jim Crow would grow to symbolize one of the most tragic events in race relation history. Promise and contradiction ruled this era. In 1865, 4 million Americans would become slaves simply because they were born black. When freedom did come their way, it was replaced by laws designated to keep them oppressed. This was the era known as Jim Crow. It was a form of racial discrimination. Most of the African Americans stayed quiet while others fought back. In the late 1880s and 90s, they started their own campaign to secure voting rights. They built their own schools, businesses, and churches. They fought to put a stop to mob violence and lynching. White supremacists fought back, and the Ku Klux Klan came on the scene and were embraced by many. White supremacy was the power behind the Jim Crow laws, and it seemed unstoppable. Over the next decade, the cruel treatment of African Americans continued. Fed up with the system, they decided to use the power of the press and the courts to pursue their quest for equality and freedom. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is the story of strength and perseverance. It is also the story of those who continue to fight for freedom, even in the face of terror. They continue to triumph, and that triumphant attitude made the world better for all of us. In 1861, the South left the Union to avoid being restricted from slavery. When the Civil War began, Abraham Lincoln called it a war that would end slavery. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in Confederate states. 6 months after the South surrendered, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. The federal government said that they would support the newly freed slaves. And these newly freed slaves knew what they wanted. They wanted to vote, have equal rights in the courts, but most of all, they wanted land.
What is it that your people need now that you're free? Our people need land, and they need tools to work the land. So there we began to see the priority to own our own land.
Without their own land and their own possessions, there was no true freedom. Off the coast of South Carolina, thousands of African Americans were fulfilling their dreams of land ownership, which was mainly supplied to them by former masters who had passed on. They began to have their own schools, they had established families, and lived a community life. They heard that Lincoln had been assassinated and their future was in jeopardy. A Southerner, Andrew Jackson, was now president, and he was against freeing the slaves. He said, "This is a country for white men, and as long as I'm president, this will be a government of white men." General Oliver O. Howard slowly made his way toward the African American colony. He was known as the Christian General because he was a deeply religious man who hated slavery. He tried to protect the land given to former slaves through Congress. To the African American population, Howard was revered second only to Abraham Lincoln.
The message from the Freedmen's Bureau that the general was coming back, General Oliver O. Howard, who they were expecting to hear nothing but good news from him because he was the man who had told them about how this land now was transferred to them and that they owned it and they didn't have to worry about massa no more and everything. He asked them to gather together at the church on Edisto. So over 2,000 people came from all amongst the oak trees and all back off in the woods and from their shacks and their dirt roads to meet there at the church to hear this new discussion about their land.
I have been sent by the President to tell you that your old masters have been pardoned and their plantations are to be given back to them, and that they would hire blacks to work for them. Lay aside your bitter feelings and be reconciled to them. General Oliver O. Howard.
So people were enraged and people started hollering out, no, ain't no way. No, that ain't what you tell us before. No, sir, no, sir.
General Howard, why do you take away our lands? You take them from us who are true, always true to the government. You give them to our all-time enemies. The man who gave me 39 lashes and who stripped and flogged my mother and sister, who keeps land from me well knowing I would not have anything to do with him if I had land of my own. That man I cannot well forgive. A freedman.
In 1866, Congress recognized there were still some people who resisted change. So, it created the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed African Americans a right to vote and due process of law. However, many whites chose not to acknowledge the new laws. The people of Mississippi were not listening. They decided that white people would always be superior and that African Americans needed to know their place, which, to them, was the cotton fields of the South. But former slaves refused to be trapped after coming so far. They used their votes to elect black representatives, they sat on black juries, and they sent their children to school.
What had alarmed the white South during Reconstruction was not evidence of black failure, but evidence of black success, evidence of black assertion, evidence of black independence, evidence of black advancement, and evidence that black men were learning the uses of political power.
Those who were against the rights of African Americans resorted to violence. The same year that whites resorted to violence was the same year that Reconstruction began. Nathan Beckford Forrest, a Confederate general, founded the Ku Klux Klan. The images in white hoods killing African Americans, but the light of burning crosses would forever be a memory never to be forgotten.
The way white supremacists made sure that ex-slaves would fall back into place or nearly back into place was terror. Beating people up, burning down their houses, shooting them, just the usual physical mayhem of personal violence.
After a reign of violence, there was hope with the election of Ulysses S. Grant in 1869. he sent federal troops to the South to stop the Ku Klux Klan. However, federal intervention proved not to be enough.
The question of, should we stay at home in the South? Should we stay at home in the United States? Should we move somewhere else to the North? Should we move to the West? Or should we leave the United States entirely?
Burned out and feeling hopeless, some turned to an unlikely old man named Benny Singleton. In 1874, Singleton, a former slave, would lead a group of African Americans to Kansas. Then, John Brown struck his blow against slavery.
We needed land for our children. That caused my heart to grieve in sorrow. Pity for my race caused me to work for them. Confidences perished and faded away. We are going to leave the South. Pap Singleton.
Kansas may have been the promised land, but the journey was brutal. Many died from hunger and exposure to the elements. Yellow fever took several lives, but the biggest fear was encountering murderous whites. Those who survived the Kansas trip were met with harsh lands and violent tornadoes. They allowed their spiritual side to lead their way, and within a few years, over 20 towns were built. But not all African Americans thought that the answer was to leave the South. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, had become the leading African American voice opposed to a mass exodus. He said the story would be told of the hundreds who stayed in Mississippi, not the thousands who left.
The country will be told of the hundreds who go to Kansas, but not of the thousands who stay in Mississippi. They will be told of the destitute who require material aid, but not of the multitude who are bravely sustaining themselves where they are. If the people of this country cannot be protected in every state of the Union, the sovereignty of the nation is an empty one, and the power in individual states is greater than the power of the United States. Frederick Douglass.
During the Spanish-American War, African Americans had fought next to whites and were beginning to use their skills and newfound freedom to become respected, productive members in society. They had begun to hold positions of power and various jobs previously held by whites only. However, many white people of the time did not see the equality as a good sign and became alarmed. In Wilmington, African Americans made up a significant portion of the population, and they were the majority of the voting population. Since African Americans held many positions of power, the white population was afraid that they were losing their grip on the power in the city. This spurred the beginning of the Party of White Supremacy, which argued that the Democratic Party could save the people from Negro rule. To help restore the power, Frenfold Simmons, Josephus Daniels, and Charles Aycock designed a campaign portraying white women endangered by the African American men in office. This also brought to surface another sensitive issue of interracial couples involving an African American woman and a white man, and how it was considered inappropriate. Voting became a controversial topic because whites were threatening African Americans and discouraging them from voting, and African American women were threatening African American men if they did not vote. Despite many African American men turning out for the vote, all of the African American candidates were outvoted. However, this was not good enough for the people of Wilmington, and they drove the African American officials out of office. While the African American officials were targeted, no one was safe, and a massacre took place in the streets of Wilmington. Despite begging for help from the White House, President McKinley stayed out of the issue. Once the African American population had been removed from office and run out of town, the ads turned to promoting the segregation of everything: transportation, restrooms, schools, essentially all public areas. However, some people saw the Jim Crow laws as an obstacle to be overcome. One such person was Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She returned to North Carolina to teach, and she opened up her own school. Receiving funding was difficult, but she had the girls write letters home telling patrons what they were learning and requesting financial support. While the school appeared to be vocational on the outside, the school also focused on developing well-rounded individuals. She worked to teach the girls that they could be as good as anyone else, regardless of the color of their skin. Within her school, she tried to shelter her students from the racism that surrounded them. While Brown tried to protect her children, many others were unfortunate and were given long, unfair punishments for petty crimes, and often forced to serve on chain gangs. A convict leasing program was started by which landowners or anyone who needed laborers could pay the state for the convicts to come do the labor. It was almost the same thing as slavery, but under a different and crueler set of circumstances. Since the laborers were now seen as convicts, their lives meant even less, and they were treated with unprecedented brutality. They were often treated like animals, kept in cages, beaten, underfed, and forced to work in some of the most inhospitable conditions. In fact, to keep up with demands, ridiculous sentences were passed. While a white male may only get 90 days in jail for petty theft, an African American man would get 2 years on the convict lease program. Even children were being charged harshly. Even though they were being subjected to a form of slavery that made it impossible to live without fear, they were able to come together. Their music and religion helped them unite and find solid ground in the face of uncertainty. In the early 1900s, New Orleans was considered a very liberal city. However, in the 1890s, Jim Crow came to New Orleans. One monumental case was Plessy versus Ferguson. Omar Plessy appeared to be Caucasian. On the train, he was not considered African American until he identified himself as such. After that, he was told to either relocate to the correct seating area or get off the train. In 1896, the case Plessy versus Ferguson allowed for the legalization of segregation under the terms that the accommodations be separate but equal. This law allowed each state to make their laws accordingly. 2 years later, Another law allowed states to disqualify African Americans from voting. This caused a severe drop in the African American voters, especially in Louisiana, where they dropped from 130,000 to just 5,000 votes. As their rights and liberties were being stripped away, African Americans found a great means of expression through music. Jazz music changed the way music was written and performed. It challenged and broke down the barriers between African Americans and white communities, and the notion that African American people were inferior. Historically, African Americans had wrongly been identified as inferior and savage. Racism and ignorant fear made people blind to African Americans' talents, education, and skills. This fear was amplified through images and advertising. To help ease the fear and tension in society, Booker T. Washington tried to convince African Americans to work within the system and just drop the issue of civil rights. He gained favor within the community for his approaches to making a business person out of an African American. Many people tried to follow this example and work on developing a life skill that would enable them to get a job and find their place within society. Women even began to specialize in high school and would graduate with a special honor on their diploma. However, W.E.B. Du Bois rejected Washington's ideas because even as they were working within the system, there was still racial terrorism and lynching all across the South. In 1903, Du Bois wrote an attack against Washington, saying that their rights could not be given up and that they should not accept being an unequal race. Although Du Bois disagreed with Washington's ideas, Washington was still able to become one of the most influential African American men in America. He gained support from business persons such as Carnegie and Rockefeller, and even Roosevelt endorsed his program. Even as Washington's fame grew, Du Bois's insults grew more intense. In 1906, Washington visited Atlanta as it was booming, and he considered it a prime example of what African Americans could achieve if they followed his ideas and worked within the system. Unfortunately, his image was constructed from only a few prominent cases of success, when in fact, Atlanta was one of the most segregated cities at the time. Already, tensions in America were high, but when Thomas Dixon's The Klansman opened in Atlanta, racial tensions mounted. The Klansman reinforced the idea of the lustful, savage African American male preying on the innocent, young, white female. And in the play, the solution was the Klansman, or the Ku Klux Klan. During the opening week of the play, the press reported several false accusations of rape. This caused mass hysteria, and a mob gathered in downtown Atlanta, leading to a massive riot of whites against the African Americans. When attacked, those who didn't fight were knocked down and beaten up, but those who tried to defend themselves were often killed. Walter White and his father lived in Atlanta at the time and were often mistaken as Caucasians. They prepared themselves in case the riot came to their house. Walter was only 13 at the time. This experience led him to become one of the foremost civil rights leaders in America. After the riot, Washington visited Atlanta to salvage the idea that African Americans could live in close proximity to whites working within the system. He tried to still use Atlanta as the ideal system, but Du Bois used this opportunity to show that it did not work. In 1910, Du Bois moved to New York, joined the NAACP, and became the editor for their publication, The Crisis. When he started writing for the publication, he supported Woodrow Wilson because he promised justice and fairness for African Americans, and Du Bois made it clear what the African American population expected from Wilson. However, after Wilson took office, 3 cabinet members were allowed to segregate their departments, and this enraged Du Bois. In 1915, The Birth of a Nation, the motion picture version of The Klansman, was released. The NAACP launched a campaign to have it banned after outbreaks of violence in cities where the movie played. This film also caused a surge in membership for the Ku Klux Klan and gave Northerners an insight into the amount of racism the South experienced. The fight to have the movie banned and reduce racism was still going when Booker T. Washington died in 1915. Despite their differences, Du Bois praised his work, but also pointed out how little progress African Americans had made under his influence. When President Wilson declared war in 1917, Du Bois reluctantly supported him because he knew that the Army was not free from Jim Crow laws either. In 1917, the 24th Infantry, 3rd Battalion, a segregation of African American soldiers, was assigned to Fort Worth, Texas. At the time, the police were coming down especially hard on African American criminals. The soldiers who were stationed there dealt with non-stop harassment from the police for months and finally had enough. On August 27th, the soldiers mutinied and a riot broke out in the streets of Houston, leaving many dead. On December 11th, 1917, 13 men were tried and hung, some of which were arrested without cause or not told of their crimes or execution dates. One soldier even requested to be shot as a soldier instead of being hung, and that right was denied. These good soldiers, who had fought for America, had enough of racial discrimination. They decided to fight back, but at the cost of their lives. Even until the 1940s, the Jim Crow laws were prominent throughout the South. Corporations and other organizations continued to enforce segregation of the community. Attitudes of white supremacy ran rampantly during this time. Life was at times insufferable for people who were not white. At the time, this woman felt the effects of this racist era in a personal way.
Laborers, what could you do all day? Where did they go to the bathroom? Where did they get a drink of water? Something as elemental as that. Not a lunch counter, just water.
This woman could never undo the harm done, but unfortunately, she was not the only one.
This particular day I was going to Tupelo, and I looked up at the top of the house right on the street there, and I could see it was burning. So I ran to the front door and knocked, and it was a white neighborhood, of course. The woman came, "What do you mean talking? Coming to my front door?" I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I said, "I was going to tell you that your house is on fire." She said, "Wait a minute, come."
In the midst of racial tensions, a tragedy struck the United States that affected all people: Pearl Harbor. As America prepared to go to war, many of the men who worked in the factories and other skilled labor positions were off to fight. Many of the African Americans and other minorities were able to enter the workforce because of this fact. Besides entering the workforce, African Americans also served in the military, although they served in segregated units. African American soldiers knew that their enemy, Hitler, had taken racial prejudice to an extreme level. They knew that they were hated, but they bravely fought for their country regardless. There, they witnessed the atrocities that Hitler's army committed in the attempt to exterminate certain populations. While the United States did not have concentration camps, the African American soldiers who witnessed the Holocaust were no strangers to the level of violence and hate that the human race is capable of committing. As African American soldiers occupied France, they found that French society was more accepting of their race, and they were also treated more equally. In America, dancing with a white woman could get an African American killed. But in France, this type of activity was not considered taboo. Listen as this man recalls his experience in France as a U.S. soldier.
We were in a nightclub, and there was a group of soldiers there, and we were having fun, laughing, and the white soldiers became jealous of it, I suppose, and they tried to pick some kind of ruckus, you know, to the extent to where I had to go and talk to the sergeant, who was the highest ranking person with that group. And he says, "Well, you know, if you was if you was in the United States, you wouldn't be having anything to do with these white girls." I said, "Well, you call them white girls, I say they're French girls as far as I'm concerned."
As African American soldiers returned from war, they should have been received as heroes, but instead, they were treated with just as much disrespect as they had been before. Restaurants and businesses were still segregated, and an African American still had to give his or her front bus seat to a white person. Still had to attend under-resourced schools, and still had to overcome many obstacles to merely place a vote in order to elect an official. If fighting and giving one's life for America would not make an impact on racial equality, then the platform had to change. It had to move into the political realm. The political environment was not favorable to granting rights to all races and ethnicities within the United States. But if Jim Crow laws were to be repealed, then the political environment, the courts, was going to be the only place where these laws could change.
But it was a dangerous thing for blacks to try to vote. And that, you know, power was involved, status was involved. And, you know, whites knew that if blacks voted in mass, then white politicians would respond to black concern.
There was an undercurrent of fear and intimidation that was permeated from an influential and large organization, the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK. This group threatened African Americans who sought to exercise their rights, especially at the voting polls. Often, there would be lynching or cross burnings that further spread the message of hate. The organization was strong because it included law enforcement officers, lawmakers, and judges in many towns and cities. In Walton County, Georgia, 4 people were murdered in the middle of the afternoon. Even until this day, no one has been convicted or charged with the murder, even though it was a group of people who committed the crime. The story of Lamar shows a man who is accused of witnessing this murder. His life was threatened if he were to go to the authorities with any information.
Next day, I went back to the ice house, and these 2 white fellows asked me, well, what'd you tell them? I ain't tell them nothing because I didn't know nothing to tell them. And then they kept on the question, I know you told them. What did you tell them? You better tell me. If you don't tell me, I'm going to kill you. And he pulled the hammer back on that gun and pointed right in my face, about this close to you. And that bear looked like it was that big. But I still didn't tell him anything. I said, I don't know nothing, I can't tell you. And then they tried everything they could around there. Then one told the other one, he said, oh, let him go home. He don't know nothing. He don't know nothing. He said, now I'm gonna tell you, you go home, you don't stop talk to nobody, and don't do anything. You go straight home. I have had nightmares. I would go to bed at night. I'd be scared somebody would come up there and get me. I even changed my name from Lamar Howard to Lamar Jones for a long time.
The case of Lamar gained the attention of President Harry S. Truman, thus starting Truman's platform for civil rights.
The extension of civil rights today means not protection of the people against the government, but protection of the people by the government.
Harry Truman began to address and meet with the NAACP and take its issues seriously. He began to endorse a strong civil rights platform, despite the fact that it was recommended that he abandon the platform in order to secure more votes for his presidential election. But when he became re-elected, it was evident that the American people were becoming ready for a change within the country that supported the rights of all. President Truman made a significant contribution to bringing equality to America when he signed Executive Order 9981, which racially integrated the military. As soldiers of all backgrounds learned to depend on each other, the barriers of racial stereotypes and assumptions began to dissolve. The tone began to change in America concerning racial tensions. While there were many who still supported racist ideologies, the number of those who had a more open-minded and accepting point of view began to grow. Racial issues also began to gain momentum in the political realm as court cases began to be taken more seriously. Most importantly would be the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. In the town of Farmville, a young girl decided to lead a student strike in her school, a strike that demanded better resources. Her entire class rushed into the school board and demanded better treatment. The board threatened the children's parents with imprisonment and job loss. In the end, the situation caught the attention of the NAACP, and they combined the case with others that would eventually be the historic Brown versus the Board of Education, the court case that ended segregation in schools, which were government institutions. Thus, the last of the Jim Crow laws began to be erased from legislation, but they will never be erased from history itself.